going to show you how I make my grid patterns for my tapestry crochet projects. This has been a highly requested video. Y'all want to know how I design my tapestry crochet projects, how I do it, all that jazz. So I decided I'm gonna do it for this project here because it's a very simple project. I'm gonna show you the steps that I go through in order to get an idea onto my iPad, onto a crocheted vest such as this. I do have a video of where I did make this vest if you're interested in watching that one. I also have this pattern on my Patreon. So let's get right into designing this vest. So let's take a look at the Procreate app. Now what I love about this app is, one, you can create so many different layers. There is eventually like a cutoff limit, but it's like 90 something. Now you do have to pay for this app. It was under $15 the last time I checked, but it is a one-time fee. You don't have to like subscribe like yearly or anything like that, like say like Adobe Photoshop and stuff. It's just a one-time fee and that's it. And honestly, I think it's worth it. You can have a drawing guide, which I mean is the selling point for me to make my grids, because you can change the grid size. What I normally do is each square is a single crochet, so I can change the grid depending on what project I'm doing. I can insert photos, I can insert files, I can add text to my projects. Now, of course, you can use other programs, okay? There are some free ones online, but they only take you so far until you have to pay a subscription fee, which I was gonna do at one point, and I'm like, Procreate can just do it for me. Now, if you don't have an iPad or a tablet or a computer or anything like that, you can use graph paper. Remember using graph paper? I used it all the time in high school. But anyways, you can use graph paper to make your grids because you just need a bunch of squares. And you know what? You could just use Windows Paint. That would work too. It's just you won't have layers, unfortunately. Now, before we get into me actually showing you the grid, I do want to show you some of the features that Procreate has. I'm not sponsored by them. It would be nice, but I love this product anyway, so I just want to show you. I love the layer feature on this because I can move around the layers, I can move around what I'm creating, because sometimes the first version of anything I do is definitely not the final version, and because of layers, I can pick and choose where I want to move things up, where I want to move things down, do I want to duplicate layers, stuff like that. I can add more colors and all that kind of fun stuff. Also, Procreate has a ton of cool brushes, and there's a lot of free ones you can find online as well, like this little star one that I absolutely love. You know, just create more layers and just add cool graphics onto my projects. I also like playing with the opacity of layers because sometimes if I'm using an image as reference, I can, you know, be able to see that image behind what I'm actually drawing on top of. And sometimes I just don't know what colors I want in a project until I draw it out. So I can use the color drop tool and change up the colors, and then that way I know what yarn I'm gonna buy, and that way I'm not wasting money on yarn that the colors just aren't gonna look good with. So I'm just gonna go into Procreate, and then I'm going to create a new project and do it on screen size. And to help you make a grid, I go into Canvas, I turn on the drawing guide, and then that way you can see a grid. And what I'll do now is I will actually draw the grid out using the pen tool. Following the grid, I will just draw lines straight across, because if you look at it, each one of those squares is going to represent a single crochet. Now, a little trick that I do is I'll draw a few lines and then I'll duplicate that layer, and then that way I can just pull that layer down and then I'll have like twice as much line. So that's what I normally do when I am making a grid. I don't draw every single line out. I do like a few, and then I just like keep duplicating it until I have enough squares for my project. Now, I do want to say, once you make a grid, you don't really have to keep making them. As long as you have it saved in Procreate, you can just keep reusing the same grid that you made the first time, unless you have to change it up. But for the most part, I've been using the same grid since probably my first project. Also, the grids that I normally make are a lot smaller than this. Like the squares are a lot smaller because, you know, if I need 70 single crochets across, I have to make sure I have 70 individual squares. But I just kind of made this one a little bit bigger. That way you can see it a little bit better. Then once you have the grid the way you like it, what I'll do is I will start another layer, but I'll put that layer underneath the grid. And this is when I can just start drawing out my design. That way the color is behind the lines of the grid, and then I can like distinctly see what square goes with what color, which means, you know, like what crochet I have to do. You know what I mean? So again, each one of those little squares equals one single crochet. Now that I'm done showing you basically the basics of how to make your grid, let's get into how I made my grid to give you a little better understanding on how everything just comes to life. First off the bat, what I like to do is I like to number each one of the squares. I do it in 5s. That way, you know, you're not writing every single little number out. But this also helps me when I'm doing more intricate patterns because I'm like, okay, where do I need to start this color? Well, if I look at the chart, I know it's 55 single crochets in. All right, that is when I need to add that color. That is the stitches across. Now going up, these are still single crochets, but these are the rows. These numbers here signify the rows of the project, and this is also very helpful when I'm trying to figure out what color goes where. I can use the stitches, I go up to the amount of rows I need. It's just very handy. Now this pattern is a little bit different from my other ones because it is going to be a vest, so I'm not going to be using the entire grid, but if it was, I would be coloring the entire grid in. So now I'm going to start adding in my colors and my design. Sometimes I also use a pixelated website, and that is where I can drop an image and it pixelates it for me. For instance, the one time I had to make that car on a sweater, that's what I did, and it really helped me. You can also change the size of the pixel too. So this is only like 8 pixels, and the higher the number, the more pixelated, the more chunky it is. You see how the image on the right is a lot more chunky, a lot more blocky. This is very helpful when you're trying to put it into a grid. Now you can save it as a JPEG or you can save it as a PNG. Either way, it works when you put it into your grid. When you put it in your grid, you're just going to add the photo. This is the heart that I just showed you that I made on the pixelated app, and I'm going to put the layer behind the grid, and then that way I can see the grid and the squares. You can adjust it to wherever you would like it to be on the grid, and then what I do is I actually make a new layer and I take the opacity down on the original layer. That way I can draw on top of it and still see the old shape but see the new shape that I'm creating, and of course this is all underneath the layer of your grid. Now the pixelated image isn't always going to be perfect, and this is where you go in and kind of finesse and make those little changes to your image to make it look more like what you want it to look like. Like, it didn't really look like a heart, but then when I did a little bit of adding here and taking away there, it became the shape that I wanted it to be. That is how I pixelate an image online, and now let's get back to my design. Again, you want to make sure that you're drawing behind the grid. That way you can see all your stitches. I like to start with my background color, which is going to be this red, and whatever color your project is going to be, I like to make my grid a very contrast color, so that's why it's this lime green, because then I know that the colors are going to show up. Because here's the thing, I use a lot of white and a lot of black yarn, and when I do that, you can't really make a white and a black grid because then your colors aren't really going to show through the grid if they're the same color. So definitely use a contrasting color for your grid. Usually I use a bright pink or a bright green. Now that I have the base color for my project, I'm going to start drawing in my design, and for this design I wanted to put little tiny hearts. Now for this project, because I knew they were going to be little hearts, I really didn't need to go really extreme, I knew that I could just kind of eyeball it and, you know, just draw it out myself. But certain projects, such as the car sweater I did and some of the other projects, I did actually use a website to pixelate it. That's another way you can do it if you have more complex images. But for this, I knew it was going to be a heart. But although I did have some trial and error trying to figure out the perfect shape for a heart, what's the heart gonna look like, so even the easiest symbols or patterns can be very frustrating. Like, don't get me started on circles. Those are a nightmare. If you saw my Halloween project where I tried to make a moon, yeah. Now that I have decided that this is the heart shape that I'm gonna go for, what I can do is I can start playing around with it, figuring out where I want it to go on this vest, how it's gonna look. My first idea was I was just gonna put a bunch of random hearts everywhere, so I'm just kind of copying and pasting it. That way I don't have to redraw it every single time, which is a time saver. So I was just kind of like doing that for a little bit. Then I did decide that I really just wanted some nice, clean, straight rows of hearts. I think this looks really cute. I did more a simplistic pattern for this one, but I think in the end that's what I really wanted, and you saw how it turned out. So I think doing this was a really great idea. And sometimes if I'm not too sure, I will leave both options up so I can kind of toggle between both of them and figure out what one I like best. This was the winner of the design that I chose. Now for me, I like to crochet right to left, so I will start at this corner down here. And then I will just work my way all the way down, and then I will turn it over and go back the other way, so I will have a good side and a back side. Another reason why I love using Procreate to make my patterns is so then that way I can actually create a layer and highlight all the rows I've already done, and then that way it's not going to confuse me. I like to have the opacity of that layer turned down. That way I can still see the design underneath and know where I'm going and know where I've been, so you can kind of see how that looks right there. It works so good for me. And another reason I like using Procreate is, say right here, this heart is a little off. Well, I know I can click that layer and I can move it back over. This is just an example. I knew what I was doing. But anyways, I can move it back over and I can make adjustments to my project as I'm crocheting it. In the end, that does make things a lot easier. I've done that countless times, having to move things over, having to add rows, just having to do little edits while I'm crocheting. And I just want to let y'all know that this pattern that you see right here is not actually the final version of my vest. If you want the final version with all like my notes and the ribbing and the connecting and all of that, you definitely can check out my Patreon. This is pretty much the first draft of my pattern, because this pattern that you see here, I added stitches, I took away stitches, I added rows, I took away rows, and I did a lot more things to this project. Just an FYI. All right, that sums up the tutorial on how I make my Tapestry Crochet project grids. There are other ways that you can make grids. This is just something I personally like doing. I like having a little bit more control with how I can, make my grid, and that's why I like Procreate, because I can edit it as I'm actually crocheting to make sure everything is where I want it to be. I really hope I answered any of your questions that you might have on how to make a tapestry grid crochet project. I took notes and I did my best to explain how I do it. Hopefully everything made sense. So yeah, I hope you have fun making your own tapestry crochet projects. If you are new to my channel and like sewing, thrifting, crafting, and of course crocheting, why not hit the subscribe button? You can follow me on my Instagram, my TikTok, and of course my Patreon. I hope you all have a great day.